Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the Bipartisan Policy Center's Elections Project event entitled The Challenges of Counting the Vote in 2020. Much ink has been spilled and many webinars have been hosted on the changes to the ways Americans will vote this year. But as the Bipartisan Policy Center's Task Force on Elections has stated in its report in January of 2020, changes to one part of the voting ecosystem, in this case, how voters will cast their ballots, necessitate changes upstream and downstream, both to the voter registration process, but also to the counting and auditing and recounting process. Counting, auditing, and recounting will look very different this November. For example, when can election administrators start to pre-process absentee ballots? What even is pre-processing, since there's a lot of confusion about that process right now? What will election night reporting look like? What happens if elections are quite close and recounts become a part of the process, where bipartisan teams have to sit very close together? Social distancing will be hard during those kind of situations. Our panelists hail from 3 closely watched swing states, and let me introduce them for you now. Brian Corley is the supervisor of elections for Pasco County, Florida. He's been in that role since 2007. And during his tenure, his office has been recognized for innovation, efficiency, and transparency. Brian has served in numerous roles for national organizations, including the Bipartisan Policy Center, and is a past president of the Florida State Association of Supervisors of Elections. Sherry Poland has been the director of elections in Hamilton County, Ohio since 2014, and began her work in that office in 2004. Sherry has volunteered for a number of organizations, boards, and committees, including Bipartisan Policy Center's Task Force on Elections. Megan Wolf is the administrator of the Wisconsin Election Commission, a role she has served in since 2018. Her work on behalf of Wisconsin voters began in 2011. She has served as a representative to the Election Assistance Commission Standards Board, the Executive Board of ERIC, the Executive Board of the National Association of State Election Directors, and the Executive Committee of the Election Infrastructure, Information Sharing, and Analysis Center, or EIISAC. Of course, most importantly, Megan has served on BPC's Task Force on Elections. Now, our excellent moderator today is Jessica Huseman from ProPublica. Jessica covers voting rights and election administration and is the lead reporter for Electionland, which has won many awards, all of them well-deserved. My role here is to do this introduction and get off your screens, and I will do that after 1 second, which is tell you that if you are following us on our Zoom broadcast today, we encourage you to ask questions via the Q&A box on the bottom or right hand of your screen. We will get to as many of those as we can. So now, Jessica, I turn the panel over to you.
I was muted. Thank you. I appreciate it. This is the most exciting panel I have done so far this season, and there have been many. So I am looking forward to everything that you guys have to say. So I'd really like to get a sort of update on where your states stand now, what you're doing now to prepare for your next thing, and then how you prepared for the thing that came before. And so I know that's a broad question, but I'll let you guys take that wherever you like. If we could go ahead and start with Megan, I think that would be great.
Speaking from the perspective of the state of Wisconsin, a major challenge is making sure that voters know the statutory requirements to ensure that their ballot is counted. There's a lot of mis and disinformation surrounding how and when ballots are counted. I think, for example, it's often misunderstood that all sufficient absentee ballots are counted. We know from doing some surveys that there are many prevalent rumors about absentee ballots only being counted if there's a tight race, when in reality and by law, they're all counted at the polls on election day. Another common misunderstanding is that the results you see on the news ticker on election night are official results. Now, it's different in each state, but in Wisconsin, these results are unofficial and they're aggregated by the AP, not by the state. The state doesn't actually certify the total or the results and the winners and declare the winners and losers for nearly a month after the election. And the reason for this is because every single municipality and then each county, and then finally the state has to actually reconcile and certify those results before they are official. Another factor, of course, is changes to the process that may be the result of legislation or litigation. And this is something that we certainly have a lot of practice with in the state of Wisconsin. So it can be challenging as it is to make sure that voters understand the statutory requirements to ensure that their vote is counted, such as having a witness sign their absentee ballot certificate, or when their ballot has to be received received by their clerk or their polling place in order to be counted. But to further complicate these things, requirements like this aren't always static. And we saw a lot of this in our April election in Wisconsin. And so I think having a plan to communicate changes, such as establishing connections with, I think mostly such as establishing local election offices and election officials in general as the official source of information, and then continuing to develop relationships with community groups and organizations, with the media, with elected officials, to ensure that we're able to reach out to voters with new information through channels that they trust. And I think this is really important groundwork that we need to lay now in order to create resilient elections that can keep voters informed of requirements to ensure that their vote counts regardless of changes, regardless of what might happen or evolve in the current health crisis. And this is something that we all need to work really hard at, and that we need to work together on to accomplish this as we head into the fall elections.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Sherry, would you like to take it away?
Yes, sure. I echo a lot of what, almost all of what Megan had just said, as far as I think we definitely need to educate voters on the process. We need to, time is what's important right now. When you started this off, you said, let's take a look back at where we were, maybe how many of us have administered elections during this pandemic. And in Ohio, we were set to have an in-person voting on March 17th. We had 28 days of in-person voting at our early vote center, as well as by mail. And then literally at the 11th hour, late in the evening on March 16th, we were ordered to keep the polls closed on March 17th. And then we went into what we sort of refer to as a spontaneous all-mail election. The General Assembly in Ohio about a week later determined that the election would be extended through April 28th, primarily all vote by mail. That was challenging for boards of elections and for voters, because 70% of voters in Hamilton County, and I think that holds true throughout the state of Ohio, choose to vote in person on election day, even though no-fault absentee voting has been around for over a decade. So we struggled with that quick turnaround time. So did the voters. And we struggled with educating the voters to know what steps they needed to take in order to make sure that their vote was counted. We did what we had to do during that time, but we learned that that's not the process that needs to take place going forward in November. There are some policy changes that can be made that will ensure voters, their votes are counted properly. I think those changes need to be made soon, again, so that boards of elections have time to prepare their processes, secure the resources we need, and then also educate the voters. I think one thing we did take out of the primary is, at least in Hamilton County, Ohio, which we're the third largest county in Ohio, is voters want the choice. Is the feedback we got. If they want to show up and vote in person on election day, they want that opportunity. Or if they choose that that's not safe for them and they want to vote from the safety of their home, we have to provide that resource to them as well. So right now we're planning to be able to give voters that choice. And we're waiting and urging our General Assembly to take action soon and make a few little policy changes that will ensure that their votes count.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Brian, take it away.
What they said, in essence, piggyback off that, it's hard enough, working in the elections arena. And then on top of that, you throw in the last almost 4 years of our life, we've been dedicated to all things securing our cyber posture. And then here we are in a pandemic. That takes a little getting used to, but we pulled it off. I will tell you this, looking back for our presidential preference primary, which was March 17th, it was beyond challenging because we were starting to see things shut down in society. We had some counties that lost nearly 1,000 poll workers. And sometimes the day before we lost polling places, and it became a logistical challenge. And you can have all the continuation of operations plans you want. It's one thing to have things written down on paper, but in the middle of the battle in the trenches, you have to make quick command decisions. And in our case, we were blessed. Sometimes crisis can breed creativity. With the schools having been shut down and going to virtual, we reached out to our school superintendent, who did a blast email, and there were many school-related personnel who weren't working, some which were not getting paid. So they became our de facto poll workers on the spot. So we were able to pull it off, and it was challenging. We did see, I'm looking at the data now, about half of all votes cast were vote by mail. And of course, I think as Sherry alluded to, voters, we want them to know they have options. You know, in Florida, it used to just be election day was the show, and now 2/3 of all votes cast are pre-election day with early voting and vote by mail. The problem is, you know, we don't know what the future holds. You know, most of us, I think all of us, are planning concurrent tracks. Hope for the best, a thoughts and prayers approach, if you will, that we have a status quo election. That's probably not realistically going to happen. So a plan B, a plan C, and a plan D, you know, where vote by mail is just going to organically increase with utilization, and also having extended early voting and vote center type concepts. We've asked our governor, you know, like most states, you have very small jurisdictions and large jurisdictions. We've asked for flexibility because one size doesn't fit all. We know this, we have to have an election and we have to pull it off. And one way or another, we're going to make it work, but it's certainly, it's going to be a challenge and then some, I think.
Okay, thanks so much for that. You know, I would love to switch this over into a conversation about something that you just mentioned, Brian, which is sort of the lack of availability of poll workers right now. So if I could, I'm going to start with Sherry. Sherry, could you talk a little bit about how your county is trying to attract poll workers during this time and how many you might have lost?
Yes. Recruiting poll workers is challenging when we're not in a pandemic, and then you add this to it, especially in light of that, you know, the majority of our poll workers are in the vulnerability category, right? They're over the age of 65. And although we did not end up holding in-person voting on March 17th, we were preparing to do so all the way through March 16th. And I do have to share this story because I think it gives you goosebumps a little bit. When about 10 days before March 17th, we were ordered by the State Department to move all polling locations out of senior citizen living facilities. And we knew as soon as that order came what the next step was going to be, and that was what we were going to start losing poll workers, and that's exactly what happened. And I don't blame any of those poll workers for not wanting to take that risk. But what we did is, in a bipartisan fashion, is we just put the call out to the community and, you know, told the story of this greatest generation that's been administering our elections for years. They can't now, and it's time for the younger generation to step up and take that role. And it was unbelievable, the number of calls we got in those final few days from, as similar to Brian, school teachers. All of a sudden the schools are closed, I can work the polls today. Or, you know, college kids that I'm home from college now, I can come work the polls. And it was pretty remarkable to see that, and especially in just those final few days. So our hope is to, again, our plan is to reach out to those, share that message. We also have a really strong youth at the booth program in the state of Ohio, where 17 and 18-year-old high school seniors can work the polls. We've had a lot of success with that. We're asking our General Assembly to reduce that requirement a little bit and allow 17-year-old high school juniors to also work the polls. So we're going to be recruiting the younger generation. It's their turn to step up.
Okay, thanks so much. Brian, what about you?
Very, very similar. You know, our school district is the largest employer in the county, and so when I spoke to our school superintendent, asked the favor if he could send an email blast out, he said, "I'll do it." He goes, "I'll tell you right now, you're gonna have a waiting list." And thank God he was right. So we all reached out to our county administration. Wonderful program. We partner with them. It's called Sympathy. So we have county employees who they get paid to perform civic duty. They come work for us, pay them differentials. So it's a win-win. Also reached out to the sheriff. I actually had a sheriff deputy who was our poll deputy for a few minutes until our regular assistant poll deputy could make it out. We had adopted precincts, which is fantastic. A lot of civic organizations, Rotary clubs, co-ops, etc., they will adopt a precinct with their staffing. And so being creative and then some is the challenge is really going to be for not getting workers. We are currently right now doing a survey of existing poll workers and asking, you know, politely, hey, plan on being with us in August, November, know what we're up against. training. As Matt alluded to, social distancing, we can 100 people in very close quarters during training, looking at doing some virtual online training world. So I think we're going to be okay.
Hey, Brian, I'm so sorry. I think that your connection is a little bit wonky. So the production folks are going to work with you on that, and I'll come back to you. But if we can move very quickly to Megan. Megan, I feel like the whole country was watching as you guys struggled to find poll workers and had to close polls and move people in 1,000 different directions only hours before the vote was supposed to take place. So I would love to hear from you about, how that was like and what you did to manage it. I'm sure none of us would like to be in your position, but you handled it beautifully. So I'd love to hear from you about how you pulled it off.
Well, thanks. I think there was such a confluence of things that were happening at that time. Our April 7th election, ballots went out for that election at the end of February. And so when our first stay-at-home order came about, in the middle of our election, and so things that we could have never seen coming all of a sudden became sort of front and center in the middle of an active election. And so as soon as the health crisis came to our attention, we started working with our local election officials to understand how this impacted their poll workers, if they were going to have the staffing level that they needed for the polling places. In a large turnout election, and Wisconsin is a high turnout state in a lot of these elections, we need about 20,000 poll workers statewide. And at the state, we don't train or recruit the poll workers. It all happens at the municipal level. So each of our 1,850 city, towns, and villages recruit and train their poll workers. And so we sent out a survey to them trying to understand what their shortages looked like. And we asked them to report if they had a critical, a serious, stable sort of situation, or if they were okay. And we had about 126 jurisdictions that told us they didn't have enough poll workers to open a single location. They could not run a polling place on election day. And then we had another over 100 that said that they were in a critical position where they weren't sure. So overall, there was a shortage of more than 7,000 poll workers as we headed into election day. And so, of course, this was extremely concerning. And then you add that in with the fact that our voter behavior had completely been flipped on its head as well. So we went from a state that did about 6% vote by mail historically in elections, and that was probably a high estimate for an election like April. And we went to over 60% of people that voted by mail literally overnight. That voter behavior turned completely on its head. And so even determining how many people are left in the pool of people that are going to show up on election day, how do you make any sort of informed estimate about how many polling places you need, what kind of accommodations you need to have? It was a really difficult sort of equation to come up with. So ultimately, what we're able to do, and we are forever grateful for their service, is work with the Wisconsin National Guard. And what they did is they sent out a recruitment in each of the 72 counties because our law does require that poll workers have to be residents of the county that the municipality is in. And so they asked Guard members to serve as poll workers in plain clothes as members of their communities. So these weren't people in uniform. They weren't serving as their military capacity. These were our voters' neighbors, friends, family, people that live and work in their communities that were serving as poll workers. But that recruitment didn't happen until shortly before the election. So now we were looking at this whole pool of new poll workers, that people that we were so grateful that they were willing to step up into this capacity, but they didn't know how to be poll workers. And so we had to develop at the state a whole curriculum of poll worker training that could be viewed and taken by the National Guard on the Sunday before the election. And then on the Monday before the election, the Guards members reported to the municipality where they were going to be serving on election day to learn more about specifics of their polling place. And then, of course, on Tuesday, they reported to their polling places to serve as poll workers. And so we weren't able to find 7,000 volunteers, but we were able to find about 2,500 National Guard members that served in that capacity. And that was able to ensure that each jurisdiction, so I still to this day can't quite wrap my head around the efforts of our local election officials and the incredible things that they did. They were so resourceful and resilient through this whole thing, but that they made happen so that polling places opened up in each of our 1,850 jurisdictions, and they had the statutorily required number of poll workers and all of the various duties there as well. And so as we moved into our May 12th congressional district race, so on May 12th, we had another election that spanned over 700 municipalities in 26 counties, and the National Guard helped in that election as well. And so it's just, such a huge relief to know that they're there to be able to assist us as we head into November, because even in some of the jurisdictions that had poll workers, we were hearing something like 50% of people that said they would be poll workers on election day ended up not showing up. And so I think, we have to have contingency plans in place if there are these last minute changes that make people uncomfortable in serving in that capacity.
Okay, thank you so much. So I would like to, just a quick note for the audience. You can type your questions into the Q&A function, and then we'll get to those in about 19 minutes. So you should feel free to ask your questions there, and we'll get to as many as we can. But first, I would love for you guys to offer some clarity. I know that this is so different in every state. There are states where the Secretary of States or the elections directors have a lot of control over what the counties can and can't do and the amount of preparation that they're able to provide for the counties. And there are certain states where they have very little control over what the counties choose to do, and they are entirely responsible for machines and recruitment and all of this. And so I'd love for you guys to each sort of walk me through what control your state has over the counties and what kind of help the state is giving the counties, and where the state can be most impactful, even in areas where the state maybe doesn't have that much sort of legislative authority over the county's actions during this time. Brian, are you back with us? Can we start with you?
Yes. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Before I ramble on incessantly, I want to make sure I'm not too choppy. So in Florida, it's kind of a hybrid. There is Florida used to have an elected Secretary of State. Now they're appointed at the discretion of the governor. We work very closely. They are the chief elections official, and just the mere position deserves respect. But we work very, very closely with in this case, Secretary Laura Lee, who's fantastic. And little things like having the equipment we use has to be certified by the Department of State, for example, and they promulgate the rules for the Florida Administrative Code, which are, of course, de facto law. But at the end of the day, where the rubber meets the road, the lowest common denominator is each county has a supervisor of elections whose job it is to administer the election. So we're the ones in the trenches. So we work very closely together. You have to have that partnership. It's absolutely vital.
Okay, perfect. Sherry?
Yes, so in Ohio, the Secretary of State, which is an elected position, is the chief elections officer for the state of Ohio. And then each county has a 4-person board of elections. We do everything in a very much a bipartisan fashion in Ohio. So there's 4 board members. 2 are nominated by the local Democratic Party, 2 are nominated by the local Republican Party, and then those nominations are sent to the Secretary of State, and the Secretary makes the appointments for a 4-year term. And then we have a director and a deputy director in each board that administers the election and runs the day-to-day operations. Our General Assembly sets the rules for elections. They set the election dates, the different deadlines, timelines, all of that. And then the Secretary of State issues guidelines for each one of those boards of elections through directives. So that for the most part, as much as possibly can happen, it's a uniform administration of the election laws throughout the state. In Ohio, we do have, I know most states, an elections officials association, and all the employees of the Board of Elections belong to that association. And we do have a legislative committee, and we do lobby our General Assembly to make policy changes that we think are in the best interest of voters. And then our Secretary of State does the same. He also lobbies the General Assembly to make changes. And after this mostly all vote by mail election that we went through. Both the Secretary of State and the association is currently making policy recommendations to the General Assembly. And we're hoping that we can get those in place quickly. So that's the basic structure of elections in Ohio.
Okay, great. Megan, I know that, you know, as we watched sort of the votes being counted in Ohio, it became clear that there were certain places that were counting votes one way and certain places that were counting votes another way. And so that seemed confusing from the outside, I think, probably for people looking in. So can you offer us some clarity around sort of what authority the counties have to choose how elections run in this type of environment?
Well, in Wisconsin, it's actually not counties at all. So we're very
municipalities. I
Yeah.
apologize. Yeah, I apologize.
So yeah, and that's probably the stem of why things are so different of Wisconsin, is because each of our cities, towns, and villages has an election official, and we have 1,850 of those. And so in other states where you'll see counties that have an election department or an election official, and it's more centralized, we are the most decentralized state in the country. And so, you know, some of those are very tiny townships that might have 100 registered voters, and they still have an election official and run elections at that level. And then you have the city of Milwaukee that has just under 1 million, and they have to run elections and have a structure to support that as well. And so we also are very different at the state level in how we operate. So most other states, as you heard, have the Secretary of State, who is an elected official or a partisan official that serves as a chief election official. In the state of Wisconsin, I'm the administrator, and I by law have to be nonpartisan, and I am the chief election official for the state of Wisconsin. And then we have a governing board that's bipartisan that makes decisions for our commission as well. So we have very little authority to tell the local election officials sort of how to conduct elections. They have to abide by the statutes. They have to make sure that they're following the requirements of the law. And we provide training and information, forms, documentation for them. But ultimately, each of their local boards of canvass are the ones making determinations about ballots being counted. And they have to try to sort of interpret the law, interpret court decisions, because in April 7th, you also saw things like all of a sudden postmarks were part of the process, which is not part of our law, but it was part of a court decision. And so jurisdictions in each of those 1,850 places, their boards of canvass had to make those decisions based on the parameters of the law.
Okay, that makes sense to me. And, you know, I think last question for me before we turn it over to a couple of questions we've gotten in from the audience. So I'd really like to focus in on election night reporting, what it will include, how long it will take, and what the process looks like in your state. So Sherry, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Sure. Well, we anticipate that hopefully election night reporting will not change too much from what we've seen in similar elections. In Ohio, we are fortunate enough that we can begin processing absentee ballots received by mail 19 days prior to election day. And I know what does that mean, processing? What that means is the voted ballots are returned by voters through the mail. They're returned in an identification envelope, and it has identifying information for the voter. So when we receive that, bipartisan teams will examine the information on the identification envelope, compare it to the information in our voter registration system, make sure that it matches and that all the required information is there. If it is, then it can be accepted for counting, and then we can remove the ballot from the envelope. Simple things as unfolding it, flattening it, scanning it through a scanner. It's important to note that we do not tabulate until the polls close. So those are sort of acts of preparation, processing. So that enables us usually on election night when the polls close in Ohio at 7:30 p.m., at 7:31 p.m. to hit the tabulate button. And those are the very first results reported in Ohio on election night. It's those absentee ballots. And we process and push sort of those out to the world via our website. I will note that if a voter does forget to list certain information on the identification envelope that's required, or if it doesn't match our system, there's a cure process. So the voter is notified, they're sent a letter, and they can provide that information up until a certain date in order to cure the defect and have their absentee ballot counted. Now, with late arriving ballots, usually in a presidential, we're not able to have all of that process completed and the ballots ready, all the ballots ready for tabulation at 7:30 p.m., but the vast majority are. And then, so we're at least able to push out the majority of the early votes shortly after polls close, and then we'll do continuing reports throughout the night of the absentee results while we're waiting for the remainder of the ballots to come in from the polling places. I hope that we don't see, I hope that will stay the pattern as most presidentials. I do know we struggled in this past primary because it wasn't all vote by mail. We had 17,000 ballots that were returned just to the Hamilton County Board of Elections in one day on April 28th. 10,000 came in the mail, and 7,000 voters utilized our drive-up drop box at our board facility in one day. 7,000 voters drove their cars to our Board of Elections and put their ballots into the drop box. So that led for a very slow count because it was so many ballots returned in one day. But I think because of the longer time frame we have for the November, I'm hoping that won't happen. But we're also beefing up our resources here so that we can count those more quickly than we did in the past primary.
Okay, perfect. Brian?
So the hypothetical election night reporting is it's a normal election, not like Armageddon election in November. We can start canvassing our vote by mail ballots 15 days prior to election day, although the results are suppressed. Amazes me. Every election day, I get a call from a candidate or somebody asking me who's winning. And I tell them, I don't know. I can't tell you. No, you can tell me. No, I can't tell you, because if I did, I'd be committing a third-degree felony. I don't know, and I wouldn't last 20 minutes in prison. So I'm not going to tell you. I don't know. So our early voting votes are also suppressed. So when the clock strikes 7 o'clock in Florida, now Florida is unique because we have the Panhandle where they're the hour behind. But for those of us that are Eastern Standard Time at 7 o'clock, we release before a minute the vote by mail and early voting totals. And I'm proud to say my jurisdiction is considered a bellwether county. I've had political strategists tell me that they look to Pasco to make predictions for the rest of the state. Former Governor Jeb Bush once said, as Pasco goes, so goes Florida. So there's a lot of pressure to get the results in very, very quickly. Although I'll take accuracy over speed any day of the week. And it's not over on election night, as we know. Elections are a lot like Thanksgiving. You don't finish your turkey, you're done, right? You have to clean up, you have dessert, watch football, etc. So in addition to having our early voting and vote by mail, then you have your precincts that modem in. Then you have your late run. As it is now, Florida voters can drop off their ballots to our offices up until 7 p.m. And, we could have several thousand at a minimum that are on the late run, but then we're not done there. Then we still have our provisional ballots, of course. Voters are never turned away, obviously. And that doesn't get, the minimum would be that following, that next Thursday night or Friday. And then we have our military and overseas voters. It's fitting that our men and women, particularly serving in the military, get 10 days to get their ballots back to us. So that's before anything is certified. And one of the things I would, ask the entire nation to take a giant chill pill, but also those reporting on election night in the media, it bothers me when we have 2/3 of votes cast that are not a precinct model. And when they show on the news, particular 24-hour channels, 8% of precincts reporting, that's the apples to oranges for the actual display of unofficial results. The key word is this: it's unofficial until it's certified weeks after election day. So what you see on election night is not what it's going to be ultimately, or it may, but we won't know until it's certified.
Got it. And I know, Megan, that things are a little different when it comes to counting mailed ballots in Wisconsin. So I'd love to hear from you about how you handle that in your state.
Sure. So, election night results we'd like to be different, I guess. And so we're pretty different there too. We actually don't aggregate or play any role in election night results at all at the state level. So on election night, each of the municipalities has to have their unofficial results posted on their county's website. And then the AP goes through and aggregates those unofficial results on election night. And we don't play a roll until each of the 1,850 municipalities has certified their results. And then each of the 72 counties does their review and certifies the results. And then they come to us for us to do our review and to certify. And that happens usually about a month later. And so that's, pretty different too. That's not to say there's still not an extreme amount of pressure on election night. Every single election, our large jurisdictions are criticized for being the last ones to have posted. Well, if somebody's going to be last, it's probably going to be the jurisdictions that have the most ballots. But, every time it's always sort of a controversy. And, our ballots also can't be processed before election day. So the first time that a clerk or a local election official or a poll worker can start opening envelopes or processing ballots, making sure that the envelopes are sufficient, is on election day itself. So 7 a.m. on election day is the first time they can start processing those ballots. And so when you look at an election like April, we had 60% of voters that sent their ballots by mail. And also the requirements changed in literally the hours before the election in terms of when they were able to when they were able to receive those and what had to be on the ballot certificate. And so, a lot had to happen in a short period of time. Now, there was also litigation that extended the period for clerks to count the ballots until after election day, because our statute also doesn't have any late return. So literally everything according to our law has to happen on election day. The ballots have to be processed, they have to be finished on election day, and there's no opportunity for a ballot to be received after election day either. And so, as we look ahead to the fall, these are things that we're going to have to make sure that the clerks have the resources they need, training, technology to be able to process those absentee ballots in that window of time that the statutes allot. Now, of course, we also have to build these processes to be resilient, because we have no idea what litigation or legislation might look like this year that could impact some of those timelines.
Okay, perfect. And so I think I would love to turn it over to a couple of audience questions that we have. So there is one that's specific to Wisconsin, so I'll go with that one first. One of our participants asks, he says, in Wisconsin, given the availability of the National Guard, why only 5 out of 180 polling places in Milwaukee, and why the excessively long lines, and how can we make sure to avoid that in November?
Sure. So again, each of our jurisdictions makes the decision in terms of how many polling places to have, what their staffing levels and resources look like. And so, that was a decision made by the city of Milwaukee in terms of how many polling places to have. There are no limits in terms of, sort of a per polling place metric that they have to use for per voter metric that they have to use for polling places. And so, that was a decision of each municipality. And so, but I do remind people, just think about the challenges of trying to plan for something like that. When you were planning for 90% of people to vote in person, and then over 60% of them vote by mail. And so you're trying to figure out, with this pool of resources, how many poll workers do I really have? How many are going to show up on election day? How many people need to vote still on election day? And you don't have any of that information. And in terms of National Guard, that 2,500 we were able to recruit, every single one of them was utilized, especially in Milwaukee County. It's not as if there were excess people that volunteered or excess members of the National Guard that we didn't utilize. And so all of those polling places utilized the maximum amount of help, I guess, that was available to them.
Okay, very good. And this is a little bit more of a broad question, but so we have a question from one of our participants who says that asking the National Guard to assist was a great choice. How did you reach out, and how long did it take to get back to you? And then I have a broader question for all three of the panelists. So Megan, how long did it take to get that sorted out?
Yeah, so it is a complicated process, and we've gotten a lot of questions about this. It's not something that an agency like ours would have any sort of authority to be able to do. Believe it or not, I'm not powerful to have my own elections army, and so the governor is the only one that can issue an order, basically activating the National Guard to do this. And there's probably a lot of things that have to happen there. And so I think communicating with all of the decision makers, developing a relationship between elections and the state's adjutant general are all important things to make sure that elections is sort of given attention in terms of critical infrastructure impact with all of those decision makers. And so, from what I understand, and I've learned a lot about the process, this isn't something that I knew about either before we had to utilize this option, is that, it's not really something that you can plan far in advance for, right? The National Guard is sent in the case of an emergency. And so you don't really know what the state of an emergency is until it's upon you. And so this isn't something that we could have anticipated, known about, plans for, a month in advance. First of all, there wasn't a month from the time of the development of the health crisis. But, that's kind of the nature of how they work, is to respond to emergencies. And there's not a whole lot of time to plan.
Okay. And, question for all three of you. I know that there have been activists that have expressed a lot of loud concern about having the National Guard act as poll workers. And so I'd love to get your perspective on that. Is that something that you think that if things continue to be this bad and poll workers continue to back out of their positions for entirely understandable reasons, if you'd be for the governor calling in the National Guard to serve in a similar role? Brian, would you like to go first?
Sure. I don't see them necessarily the need to have them as poll workers in our state, although I would not fault any of my brothers and sisters around the nation for having utilized, as I said earlier, there are certain knowns. We have to have an election. We have to make it work. And it's not that we're trying to, intimidate voters. We're trying to run elections to have, everyone come out and have their voice heard clearly. The only concern I would have is not so much for that purpose, is that voters, are so polarized, and we're seeing that it's palatable, and we saw it in 2016. And I just hope that when voters come out to cast their vote, they realize, as Bono eloquently said, that America is not just a country; it's an idea. We're bigger than just an idea or just a country. That come out, have your voice heard, but have some civility. There's no reason to, we had people come in March with profanely laced comments on their T-shirts about certain candidates, and while they have their First Amendment right to do that, we need to have some decorum and some civility. So, I've worked with our local law enforcement to make sure that everyone knows you're going to come out, you're going to vote, and we're going to have order and civility at the polls. We're not going to tolerate, issues, if you will. But as far as poll workers, I think utilizing what I mentioned earlier through the county employees, our school employees, I think we'll be okay there. That won't be a necessity. But again, I don't fault anyone who needs that to make it work.
Okay. Sherry?
Yeah, I agree with Brian, but we're not, thankfully, in the position right now that Megan was in Wisconsin, and you have to do what you have to do to run the election. So if you suddenly do not have enough poll workers to administer the election, you have to take all necessary steps. And in an emergency like that, if you need the National Guard, then that's better than not having the polls opened at all. But I'm hoping that as we plan for November, this isn't coming upon us right at the 11th hour for the November election, right? Like it did for many of us with the primary. So we're going to continue to utilize the resources that we have. I think part of that goes into trying to show the poll workers what we are doing to keep them as safe as possible while they do work the polls, making sure that we, get as many masks as we can, and the disinfecting wipes and all that sort of thing, to make them feel comfortable in order to work the polls.
Okay, great. And Megan, I feel like you've already kind of answered this question, but did you get questions from voters in Wisconsin about the presence of the National Guard, and how did you handle those questions?
Interestingly enough, on election day, there wouldn't have been any way to distinguish a National Guard member from other poll workers. Again, these were their neighbors, their friends, their community members. And so I think that people had an idea of what that was going to look like when they saw reports on it, and how it actually played out on election day was very different. And as a matter of fact, I think we just grew our pool of poll workers with a younger demographic, which I think is great as we head into the fall, because many of the National Guard members reported having a great experience, as did our clerks. They felt so supported. I mean, they were going through such a challenging time, and to literally be able to send in the National Guard to help them, I think was just an incredible support to them. And many of the Guard members have expressed wanting to continue to serve in their civilian capacity as poll workers in the future because they care about their communities. And so I think, you know, it was something that worked great in an emergency, but something that also helped us to build our base and help to recruit some younger poll workers for the future.
Okay, and you know, I'd like to move on to another question that we have in the Q&A that's specific to counting. That's what we're here to talk about. So, so could you talk a little bit about who actually counts the votes and processes absentee ballots, and how many days that typically takes to complete, and if we've got a shortage of retiree age poll workers, who will we get to make sure that that's done appropriately and with haste? Can we start with Sherry?
Sure. We have, it's our full-time staff of employees at the Board of Elections. We have 44 full-time employees. 22 are members of the Democratic Party, 22 are members of the Republican Party, and then we hire seasonal staff. Sometimes we double, maybe even triple our full-time staff, which is more likely the case going into a presidential, that we'll have triple that staff with our extra employees. Again, they're affiliated with one party or another, but I always say it's remarkable to see, because when you come to the Board of Elections, you know, their political hats go off, and everyone has a common goal, and that's to run a fair and efficient election. And when you walk through the door, you don't know which one's a Democrat and which one's a Republican. But they're charged with counting the vote, and they take it very seriously. And they work together in bipartisan teams when they remove the ballots and when they process them. And if there's any question regarding like voter intent, perhaps a voter voted a ballot by mail and they cross out a name and put error, I really want my vote to be for this person, something like that. We encourage voters not to do that. We encourage them, if they make a mistake, to ask for a replacement ballot. But when it gets close to election day, sometimes there's not enough time to send that replacement ballot. But even when we have instances like that, that goes to our 4-person board, and they vote on how to count that ballot in a public session. So we try to be as transparent as we can, to do things in a bipartisan manner. And we have uniform guidelines set by the Secretary of State that help, so that all votes, similarly situated votes, are being counted in the same manner.
Okay, perfect. And Brian, how are votes counted in your jurisdiction? Who does that counting?
Well, of course, machines, you know, at early voting. For our vote by mail, though, we bring in bipartisan teams, and I was talking about this with my management team the other day. We're so blessed that we have the same individuals who come back cycle after cycle. If you think about it, it's a very short-term duration to come help us out. And some of these folks have been helping us out for a decade. But we bring in bipartisan teams, and we're trying to configure with an anticipated large increased utilization and incorporating social distancing. But ordinarily we would have, bipartisan teams may have a Democrat, an independent, and a Republican at a table who are charged with taking the ballots out from the secrecy sleeves and ultimately having them processed through tabulators. And we've never had a shortage of getting those workers, and it's really phenomenal how, again, it's the same individuals over and over, and we don't pay them as much as we should. I think I speak for Sherry and Megan when I say that they do God's work, and we're grateful for them.
Okay, Megan.
So yeah, the local election officials, but specifically, it's not really the clerks themselves, it's their canvassers, their ballot canvassers. So these are people that are selected. First, they have to select it from a party list to try to have bipartisan representation. But these are going to be your poll workers that meet the statutory requirements to be tabulators and to count the ballots. But then again, ballots aren't just counted on election night. You're still going into then that board of canvass at the municipal and the county level. And again, these are all community individuals that are selected based on statutory requirement to make sure that there is representation on both sides. And I should also say too, I think that observers or voters in the public serve an important role in counting ballots too, because you can observe every single step of the process. So if you want to see how the ballots are counted, if you want to see how the machine tape is tabulated, you can go, first of all, watch all that be tested, and then you can watch it on election night. You can even stay for canvass if you want, and for the next month you can watch ballots be reconciled and counted as well. And so every step of the way there's the opportunity for the public and voters to watch the process, and if they see something that's off, they can bring it to the attention of the official to be able to address.
Okay, great. So a question has come in by email that I think is really interesting, and I'm gonna kind of change it a little bit. So I hope that the person who asked the question isn't too offended by that. But I'm wondering how you guys plan on working with public health officials to make sure that all of the things that you need to do to count these ballots is safe to do, and you can maintain social distancing and sanitary conditions. And I'm thinking about specifically things like recounts, which require more than one person looking at each ballot and touching the same pieces of paper and working in very close proximity to each other. Are you already starting to work with public health officials to sort of come up with game plans for how those things should happen in these conditions? Megan, let's start with you.
Sure. So this is something pretty near and dear to me coming out of the April election. We had to work very closely and very fast with public health officials. As we said from day one, we are election officials. I know the election laws inside and out, but I don't know a thing about public health. It's never been something that has been on my radar. I haven't had time for night school for med school. And so, we had to rely on those public health officials. And we basically had to take every document we have for election day, for in-person absentee, for things, how to get your absentee ballot witnessed, how to do a recount, how to centrally count absentee ballots for poll workers. All those things, we had to take a look at that guidance and redevelop it with a public health official. How do we incorporate social distancing? When should we be sanitizing? Should people be wearing masks? Should people be wearing gloves? All of those things had to be considered in every single procedural document that we in our agency. And so over the course of literally about 48 sleepless hours, we went through every document that we had with a public health official to reissue them to the local election officials. We had to do things like rethink the process of how do you present a photo ID. So the process is typically you hand the ID, the election inspector takes it, make sure that it meets the qualifications, and hands it back. You can't do that and accomplish social distancing. And so we had to come up with training and procedures. We did videos about, how to indicate a spot using painter's tape on a table and tell a voter to set their ID and then step back and then have the election official step up and look at it without touching it. All those things had to be reconceptualized and reissued and retrained. And so maybe in some ways having a lot of those new poll workers was handy in some ways because we had to train them anyway, and we had to train them on a completely different procedure. And so we're going to keep building on those as we head into the fall. We're going to assume that those things are still going to be needed as we head into the fall and incorporate all those practices into the rest of our training.
Okay, perfect. Sherry?
Yes, we also are working very closely with our public health officials. Ditto what Megan said. I know elections. I don't know anything about public health. So we definitely are relying on their guidance for that. We were fortunate enough when we had to switch from planning an in-person election to vote by mail, as we had secured a lot of PPE to send out to the polling places. And so now it was available for our staff, enough of a supply for months. And as we worked through the by mail election, we actually just completed our risk limiting audit of our primary election. And that is typically where bipartisan teams are sitting at a table side by side reviewing ballots. But we were able to make adjustments. You take a 6-foot table and one each person sits sits at each end of the table, and they wear masks and they have gloves, and then they would sort the ballots into stacks, into their own individual stacks, and then they would pass them across the 6-foot table to then recheck each other. Whereas in the past, that would be done just sitting side by side. So we're all working through our processes. I'm actually curious to see if Megan would be willing to share some of the election day processes they put into place. Example, the ID, you're right, we're typically just used to handing that straight to the poll worker. And so yeah, I'm hoping to be able to use some of the ideas that those that have had to administer in-person elections during this pandemic can share those with the rest of us.
Perfect. And Brian?
Yeah, I was just thinking with dealing with public health officials, both at the county, state, and federal level. I was thinking back to, with Department of Homeland Security, we have dealt extensively with them in all things cyber. Our good friend Matt Masterson has been invaluable. I never thought in a million years we would pivot from our having DHS help with our cyber posture to arranging a call with the CDC to talk about these protocols. But I could be mistaken, Jessica, but when you mentioned recounts, I think you looked right at me, the whole Florida recount thing. I could be mistaken on that, but just a hunch. No, I'm just teasing, of course. So messaging to the public was huge, letting the public know that, we're going to have social distancing protocols in place, working with our health department officials on configuring our early voting locations. Some concerns I have is some of our early, we're limited in Florida where we can have early voting. Some of those early voting locations could be a meeting room in a library, and it is not a large footprint. And when you have social distancing and a heavy turnout, that's going to be highly problematic. I know we had staff that were quite concerned about handling vote by mail ballot. Is COVID-19 going to be on that vote by mail ballot or the envelope on handling? So those sort of things come to mind. So it's been invaluable. It's great. They've been supportive, again, both at the county, state, and federal level. But we're all in this together. The partnerships are invaluable in these type of situations, and we expect that to continue.
Okay, perfect. Well, we are just about out of time, folks. So I wanted to thank all of you for being here. I know that your time is incredibly valuable right now, especially in the 3 states in which you guys exist. So I appreciate your time personally. I learned a lot today, so I hope that the folks that joined us on this Zoom call did as well. So thank you all for being here. I so appreciate your time. And that closes out our panel today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.